Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
This is the Adversary Universe podcast. If you're new to this, my name is Christian Rodriguez. I'm with Adam Myers, head of counter-adversary operations. I'm pretty stoked about this conversation because the last time we covered cloud threats was back in July of 2023.
Have we been doing this for almost 2 years?
Can you, what? Again,
that can't be true.
2-year anniversary coming up. Oh man,
wow.
What did you get me?
What are you going to get me?
Yeah.
Jinx.
Sebastian, welcome to the show. Sebastian is with us today as CrowdStrike's deputy manager of emerging threats, and you get to see some of everything, right? As it relates to new tradecraft, and maybe you spend a little time introducing yourself, your background, and how long you've been with CrowdStrike.
Sure. So originally I started at CrowdStrike as a reverse engineer. And basically, customers would send us malware. I would take a look at it, take it apart, write a report about it, and give them some guidance. And then at some point, I noticed that no one was really looking closely at cloud. And I thought, well, that sounds like the next big thing, and someone should take a look at it. So I just started doing it. And well, at some point, this became full time. And I've been now with CrowdStrike for 5 years. I picked up the cloud mission 3 years ago. So yeah. It's been a while.
Since our 2024 Global Threat Report, we've been posting a lot of trends on adversaries that are cloud conscious. I think this is a really great opportunity to provide our listeners with a bit of a refresher on what we're seeing, right? I think as we get into the latest trends, there's an interesting theme that we're seeing on things like IAM policies that are being treated like doormats, right? Or misconfigurations that adversaries are taking advantage of. It just seems to be, very relevant still, even though we started talking about this years ago. I don't think it's slowed down by any means. And I think that, it's just a larger attack surface, right? And so, I'd love for you to maybe share your perspective. And Adam, also maybe just jump into even what are we seeing in terms of any slowing down or increasing? What are some interesting themes that you're seeing as it relates to cloud conscious threat actors, right? The number of them, and and maybe any type of consistencies in the actual tradecraft itself, right? Targeting those cloud services.
In terms of numbers, I think we are now at around 10 cloud conscious threat actors. So that's not a lot if you consider. I think we have 250 something threat actors that we track. That's really only a small part, and I think there's still potential for those other adversaries to pick up cloud tradecraft. We still observe primarily threat actors obtaining initial access via valid account. So that hasn't changed to 2023. We did observe a lot of phishing starting with 2023 because of Scattered Spider. But then with Scattered Spider having a downturn in their operational tempo, this phishing metric also obviously went down. But now with the recent Scattered Spider compromises, the metric is likely to rise again. That's definitely something we're seeing.
You mentioned cloud conscious. It's probably worth kind of going into what is a cloud conscious threat actor.
What we mean by cloud conscious is our classic cloud agnostic threat actor. Basically, they obtain access to a machine that might be running in the cloud, but they don't really realize it. They just treat it as somebody else's machine. They, deploy ransomware to it, and
just
they don't.
Another Linux box.
Yeah, it's just another box. And in contrast to that, your cloud conscious threat actor is aware of the fact that they gained access to a victim's cloud environment, and then they use this access to the victim's cloud environment to do something to further their goal. That might be stealing your data that you're storing in the cloud or moving to downstream customers or something like that.
I think it's worth highlighting the fact that threat actors are increasingly using identity in general, but especially we're seeing that in the cloud domain, which is kind of concerning because if they have a valid credential and they log into the cloud control plane, it's going to be a bad day.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's so many specific services that run in the cloud to now include generative AI, right? We see lots of Gen AI models being deployed through various clouds. Organizations increasingly have been moving a lot of their infrastructure into the cloud, right? They're using things like M365 because hosting all of these servers and hardware and keeping them up and running and maintaining them, it's a lot of work. And in some cases, I think Microsoft, for example, they actually extend the support time for some of their systems if you're using it in the cloud versus if you're using it on-prem.
I do want to go back to something that Sebastian mentioned, and it was basically in reference to Scatter Spider, right? And you mentioned that Scatter Spider, there was a bit of a down tempo with respect to their operations, and there have been a variety of attacks that have increased attributed to Scatter Spider, again, focused on the cloud a bit. Can we walk through what the anatomy of that looks like?
The typical scattered spider intrusion would start off with them trying to basically phish the help desk, so calling the help desk, trying to convince them to reset credentials for a targeted user. They would also try to reset multi-factor authentication, and then once they control an identity, they are in. And they are in initially inside the cloud environment of the victim. So usually they try to compromise a single sign-on identity like Entra ID or Okta. And then starting from there, they basically take a look around at which services are accessible to the user. You have like this Okta dashboard or the My Apps portal that basically shows you all the single sign-on apps that you can access as a user. And they take advantage of that. One of the places they typically go to is like your internal information repository, like SharePoint or wikis, where they will take a look around, search for interesting infrastructure, any credentials that you store on SharePoint in files. And they would also look at which other users are there in the company and which might be privileged, and which they then can move to in a second step to also compromise those users, perhaps again via phishing the help desk. To gain administrative privileges, basically.
Or the big target being ESXi hypervisors, because one, they're unmanaged, so they can kind of operate on them without being detected. And two, if they can encrypt all of the servers at an organization, it's going to be a bad day.
And usually they try to take advantage of like your existing configuration that you have. Like if you have virtual desktops that you host in the cloud, like Azure Virtual Desktop or something like that, they will start up one of those and then use your existing infrastructure connection to get to your ESXi server. So it's pretty convenient to them, the whole cloud system. They can just take advantage of it.
Well, one of the things too, I think that's kind of interesting, Cristian, and maybe Sebastian to talk to this. When we see like cached credentials in some of these cloud services, that's a kind of a great way for them to move laterally within an environment.
They've been dumping cookies basically from logged in users, and have been using that to take over identities. But one interesting thing that they've also did is basically register their own identity provider within a victim's cloud environment. And if you control the identity provider, you can just like log in as any of those federated users, for lack of a better term. And you don't need to know their password or MFA. You can just log in.
That's genius. There's also one thing that we published in one of our reports recently, specific to Scatter Spider, accessing Azure environments also and using the Azure Runbooks, right? Basically to create these, cloud shells and move laterally. And can we talk a little bit about that? Can you kind of walk us through, like, what does that look like? Like, what is a runbook for those not familiar with Azure? What does that actually mean in terms of the implications of an adversary taking advantage of that?
Two things like Azure Runbooks and cloud shells, two different concepts, but fall into the same category. Basically, it's a way for you to run code. With Runbooks, you could execute PowerShell or Python code, and you don't have to execute it on your own infrastructure, which has a couple of benefits. You don't expose yourself to any defenders. They can't do any infrastructure research or something like that. So you produce less indicators in a way. But ultimately, it's a way to run code. When Scattered Spider is using Runbooks, it's usually because they are using the open source pen testing tooling Microburst, which tries to essentially find credentials that are accessible to the user that's executing those runbooks. The other thing which you mentioned, like these cloud shells, they can use that to basically interact with the cloud service provider. Again, it's serverless, it's running within the victim's cloud environment, so no indicators you're producing there. Also, there's no security monitoring there typically, so that's also a great way to stay under the radar. They use these to basically interact with the cloud infrastructure and the API of the cloud service provider. Kind of related to that, there's also these service called Azure Run commands, which basically allows you to execute commands on the cloud VMs. So that's also pretty nifty. And they've been using that to basically move laterally from having access to the victim's Azure portal to the actual VMs that are running in the cloud. And then they deploy remote management tooling to those VMs, and they've also been deploying ransomware via that.
One of the things that I always think about when I think about these cloud intrusions is it's kind of like that movie Inception, right? Because if they gain access through a compromised credential, or we mentioned voice-based phishing, which last year we noted was up 442%. So it's not just scattered spider. Lots of adversaries are doing that. But when you come in with a legitimate account that gives you access to the cloud, gives you access to the SSO environment, you can, when you do an Azure run command, let's say you're deploying a remote monitoring and management tool. And this is why, we've talked about this before, cross-domain visibility is so important, because if you don't have visibility into the cloud control plane and what's happening there, and you're not hunting there, then if a threat actor deploys, let's say, a remote monitoring and management tool through an Azure run command, then the defender, from their perspective, it's like that movie Inception, right? It just shows up in the middle of their environment. They're like, I don't know how that RMM tool got there, so maybe it's supposed to be there. And so that becomes a really difficult thing to start to investigate for a lot of organizations if they don't have that visibility.
And speaking of visibility, I know in a lot of these reports that we've read on Scatter Spider or any adversary that's been targeting the cloud, they also have the tendency of disabling a lot of like tooling and logs, right? So now they're limiting visibility to the victims, right, that are maybe collecting these events. And it sounds like they're just owning the entire cloud environment if they're disabling, whatever type of flows or logs or even anything that's feeding into like Jira, right? So they're disabling that and kind of breaking automation and limiting visibility for the victim.
Well, the other thing to consider too there is that a lot of times they're going through a cloud service provider's API. So you don't even have network telemetry.
Yeah, that's right. Or yeah, that's fantastic. I think we just talked about doing API analysis and doing entitlement reviews and rotating keys.
If it's there.
If it's there, yeah. If you have that option. Fascinating. Okay, so it sounds pretty scary. Like, what do companies do, right? How do people defend, right? Or how do they posture themselves for attacks that are very much focused on the cloud? Right? What are your recommendations, Sebastian, given what you've seen? And then I want you to share a crazy story.
So the ideal state is you have visibility everywhere and you basically put everything together. Basically, you take signals from everywhere. You see someone executing run commands, Azure run commands. You see an RMM tool showing up at your host, but only at that host and at no other host. And you basically have visibility from the endpoint that's seeing that RMM tool. You have visibility from someone running an Azure run command. Perhaps that login is coming from an unusual IP address, which you know from your identity product. And you try to combine all of that stuff together to basically have context. And with that context, you can then decide if it's actually malicious, because just seeing an Azure run command, that's not enough to call it malicious. And that's very often like this in the cloud, because it's just using the API as it's supposed to be by these threat actors. So that's the ideal state. Of course, correlating all that stuff, that's hard. Easy wins is basically take care of your identities. Yeah. For human identities, that's use strong MFA factors, for example, FIDO keys. Please don't use phone number-based multi-factor authentication. If you have an adversary like Scattered Spider, they will just SIM swap. So that one is basically not working for you there. Since we're talking about phishing and vishing, you need to train your help desk to not easily reset users' passwords. Yep. And that's super hard to do, basically to develop strong verification mechanisms there, especially if you're in a remote environment. And an all-time classic is don't leave long-term credentials like access keys just sitting around in your environment. At some point, they will leak. And the way to get around this is for like non-human identities, like a workload that's running on a server or something like that. For that, you would use the managed identity service of your cloud service provider that basically gives you short-term credentials. And they basically take care for you for the on the rotation of the credentials.
Like rotating it out,
Yeah. And for humans, you use like short-lived single sign-on identities. You still have the problem of once that single sign-on identity is compromised, to basically the attacker gaining access to a lot of services. But you also have a central point of enforcing basically and revoking that access.
And I think also, instrumenting that cloud with, and, there's a number of different tools that come into cloud security, right? You have cloud security posture management, which looks for misconfigurations, looks for things that you've introduced to kind of create problems within that cloud. Workload protection. So when you're running virtual machines, you're running these various cloud workloads, having endpoint detection and response deployed to those, absolutely critical. And then instrumenting the cloud control plane. having the ability to see what's happening in there, because that's going to be the first indication. So having visibility into that cloud control plane and the logging that comes from that, absolutely critical. And pull it offline, because you can't really, if the cloud is compromised, you don't want to trust the logs in that cloud. And I think a great example of that was there was a Chinese intrusion a while back, and State Department was able to identify that there was an issue. And this came out of a CSRB report, where they went through and said that State Department had been pulling all of the logs out of their Azure environment, and they were looking for anomalous access to the mail graph. And only through that were they able to determine that something odd was going on. They had kind of this correlation engine that they built that was looking at that. So it's really important to pull those logs out, and then to overlay that across your endpoint telemetry, your identity telemetry, and any other unmanaged data or unmanaged system telemetry that you're able to pull in. And that's why Next-Gen SIEM is such an important tool, because it really gives you the ability to look at everything through that broad scope and to see the overlays and see the correlation between different events.
I think, that's fascinating. I think it's absolutely necessary. Adversaries are getting faster. They're leveraging cloud. They're pivoting on-premise. You mentioned, Sebastian, how SpIDER will find credentials or do cookie hijacking and find credentials even in documents. I know there's a really great use case I covered in several presentations over the past year on SpIDER finding VPN instructions in a SharePoint server, and then some credentials that were embedded in a few documents, and they basically just wreaked havoc within these victim environments. But obviously this activity isn't just limited to Scattered Spider. This is the Adversary Universe podcast. So who else are you seeing out there, right? These adversaries are moving faster. Adam, you made a great point. Next-Gen SIEM absolutely, or any tool that allows you to correlate these events across these disparate, tool sets or data sources is super important and absolutely crucial to staying ahead of the adversary, or not getting completely outpaced by the adversary. But who else out there is actually targeting the cloud, right? SpIDER, again, very prolific, very relevant, grounded recently, as Adam mentioned. Who else are you seeing that you want to share some feedback with the listeners?
So a second adversary that currently is for me quite top of mind is Murky Panda.
Murky Panda.
Yeah, I think we released that adversary in February this year, so they are very hot off the press, and they are super interesting.
Also known as Silk Typhoon, for anybody that doesn't know the name Murky Panda.
They've been super interesting in the cloud, because they have been conducting basically trusted relationship compromises. And in the past half year, we've observed them do at least 3. So it's not that common, but it's definitely an interesting technique to be aware of. And just to explain trusted relationship compromise, you have all these service providers that you're giving access to your data or infrastructure in the cloud because they are doing something for you, and they are basically compromising that service provider and then use the service provider's access to your cloud data. So that's a very interesting access vector, and I would say at the moment very much overlooked in terms of detections.
And on that note, I think it's worth pointing out that having SaaS visibility is also important. I think will help mitigate some of that. So we made an acquisition last November, which was Adaptive Shield, which is now called Falcon Shield. So important to think about that aspect of it as well. It's in fact one of the first tools, if not the first tool, that our services team typically deploys when they're getting into some of these IRs, because they know that the visibility that comes from that SaaS environment is absolutely critical to finding adversaries.
I want to dig into the trusted relationship technique here, because I think that there's also a bit of a misconception too. It's not necessarily a supply chain attack, or would you consider it under the umbrella of supply chain?
Yeah, that for me, that line is kind of blurry when you call it a supply chain attack. I think MITRE kind of defines it as you compromising software or hardware for it to, and then getting that software somehow deployed to, or hardware deployed to the victim. And that's not really happening here. There's no software changing in your environment. There's only changes happening. And most of the time, it's just hijacking an identity in the supplier's account, not in your own. So it's harder to see,
yeah, it
argue.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you for sure.
Yeah. That's
I think supply chain attack gets maybe misapplied in some of these situations.
I know that we also are seeing activity coming out of our Chelima friends, right? Labyrinth Cholima seems to be an adversary that has been also increasing their focus on cloud. right? What are you seeing coming out of this group?
Yeah, so we've seen them repeatedly being active in the cloud, and most recently they have pretty consistent TTPs. Typically, they would message an engineer of a victim company on LinkedIn, and then invite them to join a recruiting Slack channel. And then on that recruiting Slack channel, they would give the engineer like a code archive that they are supposed to download and extend as a hiring challenge, basically.
Oh, wow.
Now, once that victim downloads that archive and executes it, that archive contains some backdoor, basically, and that backdoor gets executed. And within the case that we observed, it was within the hour of the victim basically executing the code that Labyrinth Chelima managed to steal the locally stored credentials of that engineer and use that to access the victim's cloud environment. And then within the cloud environment, they basically look at your infrastructure, whatever credentials you have stored there, and move to your infrastructure. And since that victim was cryptocurrency related, they want to steal cryptocurrency to basically gain finance for the DPRK, basically.
Sure. The weapons program, right? They're just funding the weapons program.
So
that's fascinating.
What they are typically trying to understand is, how does this application work and how can I take advantage of it to steal money? So they will look at your application logic. And in this case that I'm describing, the application was running in a managed Kubernetes environment. So they moved to a VM. That VM was set up to send commands to manage a Kubernetes environment. They sent commands there to basically get the application logic, check which services are reachable from that Kubernetes pod. And ultimately understand the application logic to steal money. And we saw that there was also like a public case that came in the news in March 2025 with the state wallet compromise. And there in the public description of the incident, the TTPs are pretty much the same, basically. And in that case, they also manipulated cryptocurrency transactions to steal money.
It seems that the Chelima groups, everything coming out of North Korea, they've really doubled down on social engineering, right? And just creating these fake profiles. I know, Adam, you and I, we discussed some of the hiring issues exactly with Famous, but it sounds like they're really doubling down on, we're just going to reach out to people under the guise of something or someone and kind of social engineer our way back into an environment, which I think is an interesting trend that I'm sure that we'll see increasing. We'll probably have to cover some topics.
I think that trend is kind of highlighted by that voice-based phishing, right? The 442%.
You can say it. You can say phishing.
I'm not. No, I'm not saying it, man. I hate that. And SMS phishing, definitely never saying that. But the thing that's I think interesting is that as the endpoint, the modern security endpoint has become a much harder target because of things like EDR, the adversaries are finding the weaker path, right? They're finding the path of least resistance. And the humans have historically been, going back forever, the weakest link in that, right? And so this is something that the Chelimas have been taking advantage of. We've seen e-criminals taking advantage of it, whether it be Curly's Spider or some of the other ones that have been really kind of focused on targeting help centers or call centers and things like that. The ones that are kind of not really doing it seems to be the pandas coming out of China, who have been kind of going the other way and focusing on vulnerabilities to target unmanaged devices.
Oh, how fascinating. Such interesting perspectives on, nation state specifically, right? Like who's taking advantage of the exploits, if you will, that seem to be the most successful, right? Given their tradecraft. And, if North Korea is focusing on the human element and China's focusing on just like network devices that are just out there for initial access, when do they combine powers and perform?
Well, but keep in mind, those unmanaged devices tend to be used to transit identities. So if you get onto one of those, you can sit there and sniff some of these credentials. So it's just a different way of attacking the identity.
That's fascinating. So how do we see AI accelerating this type of tradecraft, especially when it comes to folks even inadvertently leaving their API keys on, like, some type of block, right? Or GitHub, exactly, right? Or like somewhere in the cloud, it's exposed, right? How does AI accelerate the attacker?
For Scattered Spider, we observed basically generate PowerShell scripts that look very much LLM generated, where basically every line was commented. Like nobody would write code like that.
Oh, no way. Wow. Interesting.
Yep.
Okay. It's fascinating. Yeah.
So they basically just use it to get faster at writing code. We've also, I think it was Indirect Spider, we observed them basically visit ChatGPT during an intrusion, basically on a compromised machine. And around that timestamp, also like Googling how to do that, like how to delete backups, how to get credentials in Azure and stuff like that. So I think we mainly observe threat actors at this point use AI as a research tool.
Sure, as a bit of a crutch, right? Or a guidance to kind of help them along the attack path.
Yeah.
It's good for social engineering too. We've seen famous Chelima use it to create LinkedIn profiles to snare recruiters, and we've seen them use it to answer questions during the interviews. And there was a study, I think it was last year, that they looked at phishing emails, and they said that 54% click-through rate for AI-generated phishing emails versus 12% for human-generated phishing emails. So, AI is real good for pretending to be human.
Okay. Best practices as we wrap up. This has really been a really great episode. I know we're coming up on time. Sebastian, absolute pleasure chatting with you. But again, best practices, we heard you talk about MFA. Obviously not having your credentials just sit out there in a static fashion for adversaries to just kind of pluck, not treating your IAM policy like a doormat if you're not necessarily enforcing MFA and rotating keys. But what else would you recommend as kind of a final closing?
If you're in the position of having already fulfilled all those basic steps and you want to take a stab at nation states that might be accessing your environment, you basically want to hunt on non-human identities that are accessing your environments. And there you would want to look for any irregularities. I don't know. That service principal is always coming from an Azure IP address. Now it's coming from somewhere else. Well, that's kind of sus. So I should look into what it's accessing.
We're talking about humans being a major point of compromise, right? I'd say there's also really great training opportunities, right? For help desk that to just randomly reset passwords, right? And the help and help desk is obviously, a very big component of those roles, but we've seen on way too many occasions, help desk analysts helping to the point a little too much where they've kind of bent the rules of they're just trying to help this person in duress, which is really the adversary, and they're resetting passwords, and they're not being a little strict with respect to the way that they enforce password resets or even MFA resets, right? So I would say that's also a big step for the humans element of these attacks.
I think in terms of, securing the cloud, and this is a holistic kind of perspective, right? You can't just secure the cloud in isolation. You need to be looking across your entire environment. You need to be looking at your endpoints. You need to be looking at your unmanaged devices, what your cloud exposure looks like, all of the things, if you have OT or IoT or things like that. And really, it comes down to having that cross-domain visibility so that your SOC and your threat hunters can see everything that they could possibly need to see in order to make the proper decision. Because it's kind of like if you go to a doctor and it's a very specific doctor, but you're looking for a more general kind of perspective on your health, you're not going to get that. So really, you need to have that holistic view and overlay that data. That's going to be absolutely critical, because adversaries like to find the gray space. They like to hide in between the little nooks and crannies. Yeah. And it's important to be able to get as much visibility as possible so that you can try to find them and suss them out.
Oh, that's fantastic. Sebastian, thank you so much for being here and somehow making terms like federated identity providers and lateral movement sound less terrifying than my credit card statement on Prime Day.
Thanks, Sebastian, for coming on to the show and talking about some of the nuances of the cloud. I know that the mission is really important, and we're seeing more and more cloud activity every single day. So really appreciate all the work you're doing.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Sebastian. And for our listeners, appreciate you subscribing, sending us feedback. We just got
smash that like button.
Smash that like button. We got some really great feedback recently on some additional topics and guests that folks would like to jump onto the show. Today's session again was about cloud. We're talking about less of those fluffy things you see in the sky and more of the scary things. Sebastian, thank you again for joining us. Adam, always great to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
And again, thank you, listeners. This is the Adversary Universe podcast. Listen to the next episode because it's going to be a wild one. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.